go with her presentation. In Colorado, 100% of our lottery proceeds go to benefit the outdoors. There are 3 lottery beneficiaries. GOCO receives up to 50% of those proceeds, and we're capped at 1992 CPI levels. The Conservation Trust Fund, which lives within the Department of Local Affairs, receives 40%, and State Parks Capital receives 10%. And those 2 allocations are not capped. So when GOCO hits our constitutional cap, that rolls over into the K-12 Capital Construction Fund. The Colorado legislature approved a state lottery in the mid-1980s, and the intent of those proceeds was always to benefit the outdoors. That didn't happen right away, so in 1992, voters passed the constitutional amendment that created the Great Outdoors Colorado Trust Fund. We don't receive any tax dollars. Again, we're capped at 1992 CPI levels, and today that's approximately $67 million a year. We have an independent board that is appointed by the governor based on congressional districts, and we share 2 members of the Parks and Wildlife Commission. Right now it's Commissioner Howard and Commissioner Hauser, along with the executive director of the Department of Natural Resources as a full voting board member on our board. The Constitution defines the GOCO program and the 4 purposes through which we make investments. Half of our money goes to competitive programs. You can see there on the right that benefit local governments and open space organizations, and the other half goes to Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And before the merger in 2011, that was 25% to parks and 25% to wildlife. And just a few examples of the types of projects that we fund. We fund working farms and ranches across the state, trail systems for communities, rodeo arenas. This is in Kim, Colorado, and we fund a lot of non-game species work throughout the wildlife side of the agency, and visitor amenities throughout state parks. GOCO investments have changed over our 25-year history as the priorities of Coloradans have shifted and evolved. And additionally, our approach to marketing and communications has evolved as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Rosemary to talk a little bit more about that evolution in detail.
Just for the new commissioners, Emily is at all our meetings. She's our principal contact with GOCO. She's great to work with, so that's another inducement, Commissioner Garcia, that I'll throw your way. And so it's great to have you here as always.
Thank you.
And Rosemary, you're up.
Thank you for having me. I'm Rosemary Dempsey, Director of Communications at Great Outdoors Colorado. For the last 2.5 years, I've had the privilege of working on Generation Wild, which is GOCO's first ever major marketing effort. Let's see if I can bring it up here on the screen. Sorry about that, it's not populating the right slide. You're in the right deck there. Yep, next one. You have selected the right one there.
Whatever Rebecca was doing should have worked. It should just be the next one. We have it.
Yeah, that'd be great. If you do from current slide, I think it should work. It's not showing up on their screen.
It's not helpful for you, but it is.
We have it on our
decks.
screen.
It is, and here too, but just not here. Okay. Is it populating here at the front?
No.
No.
We can proceed with it like this and just know, unfortunately, that the audience here won't be able to see the slides.
Go to the beginning and try it one more.
Been to like 3 meetings, 6 months or so.
Isn't that weird? It's fine.
Do I, am I dealing with 2016? No, I
It's also formatting a bit strangely.
You said yes. Like call it's mostly committee.
Okay.
I don't know why
Fine.
part of it is
Most of the time.
I am able at least to click through here.
okay.
Okay.
Good commission.
Should I just proceed as is?
Good
Okay,
commission.
great.
Most of the work is done.
So we consider Generation Wild a campaign that is public serving, first and foremost, supportive to our partners around the state, and of course, mission driven. And the aim of it is to get Colorado kids and their families outdoors more often. So today I'll take you through a bit of a case study on the program to share GoCo's purpose in launching it, a timeline of its creation, budget information, and early successes from a longitudinal mixed methods research study. So before 2016, the GoCo Board of Trustees had not invested in a major marketing and communications campaign of this scale. As an entity that leverages public dollars in the form of lottery proceeds for its programs, we do want Coloradans to know that we exist as an organization, how we invest their public dollars, and what the impacts of those investments are. That's why our standard marketing and communications activities at GoCo aim to generate public awareness and to increase comprehension around the importance of conservation work and the benefits of outdoor recreation projects. In the last decade, in addition to working in those baseline marketing and communications activities, the GoCo board and many of its stakeholders recognized that the outdoor recreation and conservation industries were really faced with a challenge. The critical issue that Colorado kids and their families are becoming increasingly disconnected from nature, spending only 47 minutes per day, 4 to 7, not 47, in unstructured outdoor play. Because of this, GoCo and its partners, including, of course, CPW, recognized the issue as a critical one and saw the possibility to create change around it, to inspire kids and their families to get outdoors more often, for the sake of their own health and happiness, and also so that we cultivate a generation of future environmental stewards. It's a lofty goal to try to change a generation, but one that we felt equipped to do. Generation Wild is very connected to the mission of GoCo. Our constitutional mission is to preserve, protect, enhance, and manage the state's wildlife, park, trail, and open space heritage. And of course, it's also connected to our current strategic plan, Protect, Connect, and Inspire. Sorry about that, I just can't see the slides with that over there. Sorry about that. Yeah. So Protect is really about conserving large-scale landscapes, Connect about creating access to nature, and perhaps Generation Wild's connection to Inspire is the easiest one to make. Inspire is our programmatic on-the-ground work in 15 communities across the state to reconnect kids to nature by creating places to play, programs that activate those places, and pathways to careers and natural resources. GoCo had the resources to invest in this change creation campaign, and most importantly, it had partners across the state of Colorado, including Colorado Parks and Wildlife, to help make a movement that truly could create social change. And one important thing to note about Generation Wild is that it's not a brand building campaign. Generation Wild is mission driven first. It's proven to benefit the GoCo brand, but that was really a tertiary benefit of it. We never intended or set out to increase public awareness of GoCo. We set out to change a generation of children.
Which is a key point.
Yeah. So I wanted to share a little timeline here. Unfortunately, the audience won't see the details of the timeline, but I would like to walk through just a few things about it that stand out. Prior to October 2015, when the staff initially presented the idea of a social change movement to the board, there had been probably a decade of conversations about this issue and the growing disconnect between youth and nature. So the board said, let's define goals, review existing research in the landscape, and hold conversations with partners and stakeholders to help guide where we were headed. So that was a long process. And a year and a half later, we completed an RFP process to sign on with a partner to help us execute a campaign. So that's what you see here in May of 2016. At program kickoff, we had signed on with Sukul Advertising and Design, which is an advertising firm out of Denver with an expert creative portfolio and proven results that could help us further refine our strategy, approach, and then put creative to the campaign. They've been a critical partner in the effort, allowing us to achieve a creative campaign of a scale that we could have never accomplished with in-house resources. We have myself and one other on a communications team, and then at times 1 or 2 interns. And you'll see as part of the timeline here, we also partnered up with a third party, so outside of Sukul, measurement and evaluation firm. Early in the campaign, they're called Omni Institute, and they are experts in tracking social change. We partnered with them so that we could define a measurement and evaluation strategy and then track Generation Wild and its impacts on attitudes and behaviors over a longitudinal period. So pre-campaign, post-campaign season 1, and then post-campaign season 2. And I'll share some highlights of the results of that measurement later in this presentation. And then, of course, early in our timeline, we were also thinking about what sort of investment the GoCo Board of Trustees would want to make in a social change campaign of this variety, especially considering it was the first time they had ever done that. And what we envisioned was a 4 to 5 year campaign at minimum to try to create change, if not longer. And at that time, the board established a roughly $10.9 million budget for the 5-year campaign. Of course, we would have to prove the results and its efficacy and reevaluate it ongoing. So here's a little sample of some of the creative and media tactics that we launched with in season 1, which was the summer of 2016. Our strategy was to build awareness for the Generation Wild brand and its key messages, to motivate and activate parents to get their kids outdoors more often, and to build advocates for the movement in terms of parents, grandparents, and others in the lives of children. So this is a mix of high visibility, high frequency tactics that we used to surround our statewide target audience. We used paid, owned, earned, and shared media channels. So examples of paid media channels are TV, digital display advertising, paid social advertising. Examples of owned would be our website and organic social media. We used earned media like PR and events to generate buzz and excitement, and we also had shared media, which largely consisted of a massive partnership program. In the first season of the campaign, which you're seeing tactics from, we reached 89 million impressions and are rapidly approaching that number again in the second season. We're actually still in market right now until the end of the month, which is why I don't have a final number for you. I mentioned our partner program as being integral to making this a true movement. Our partner program includes CPW at the state parks, at the hatcheries, and with many of our marketing and communications contacts. It includes the state library system, and of course it includes the 15 communities who are working in Generation Wild coalitions across the state. So thank you to CPW for your partnership in this effort. All right, I'd like to move on to sharing some of the results that I mentioned. These are from Omni Institute, and these are entirely from the longitudinal mixed methods research study. We only received these results 2 weeks ago, but it was an interesting approach to campaign measurement where we looked at the same audience of moms with children ages 3 to 12 at 3 different points in time, which is methodologically stronger than just doing random snapshots or at different points in time with different audiences. So here are some of the exciting results we have from conducting this study related to Generation Wild. Overall, moms familiar with Generation Wild reported increased connectedness, which is a measure of both attitude and behavior, to the outdoors. Minority moms with children ages 6 and under experienced the greatest increase in their connectedness. Less connected moms also reported decreases in their own and their children's negative attitudes about the outdoors. So that's a good thing too. A lot of double negative happening there, but it's a good thing. Nearly 35% indicated that the Generation Wild campaign made them more comfortable allowing their children to play outside. So we're looking at what we can do to change a culture of overprotection. 49% indicated they shared information about the campaign, which was an increase from the time we first surveyed them of 32.6%. So good traction with the messaging and the creative. Nearly 66% reported having or using the 100 things to do before you're 12 list, which we distributed broadly in print form, but also digitally online, which was an increase of nearly 28% from the first fall. And here you can see that Generation Wild encouraged moms to get their kids outside more often between our first survey and second survey. And as I mentioned, this was not a brand awareness campaign, but it has had positive halo effects on the GoCo brand itself and on Generation Wild. 85% of moms surveyed reported a positive perception of the campaign, and nearly 77% reported a positive perception of GoCo, up 9% from the last fall. And 0% on both sides reported a negative perception. So that's good news for us. Of course, attitude and behavior change campaigns like this will take time. We can't change a generation of kids overnight. But the GoCo board and its partners like you had a vision a few years ago, and early indicators point a real return on our investment, that there's this potential for attitudinal and behavioral change and a potential to reconnect Colorado kids with nature. So thanks for your time today. If you ever have any questions about where we're headed with the campaign in the next season, or questions about the campaign origins, I'd be happy to talk with you. My contact information is on the GoCo website.
Don't go away, Rosemary. I have a couple questions for you. I don't know if other commissioners will, but talk a little bit about the creative side. And like for the thing that I'm thinking about is the fort. I don't think we'd ever have come up with the fort. Or been able to see the impact that was going to have with kids all across Colorado.
Right, so the fort is actually one of the tactics, as reported by moms, that's easiest to recall and most memorable. So some of our most guerrilla marketing tactics, as they say in the industry, or tactics that are a little bit more about generating earned media and buzz, have been the most successful. So we built a 23-foot fort that has Generation Wild branding on it. It has an anthem that gets people excited about the concept of Generation Wild. It has a hashtag so that there's social integration, but it's moved across the state for several months last year and this year. It's one of the most popular tactics that we've executed, and it also led, we think, based on the most recent round of Omni Institute results, we think it also led to the 20% uptick in fort building that moms reported as their children having engaged in from the list of 100 things to do. So sometimes the tactics that seem the most out there are actually the ones that resonate most with people and create the most memorable impression.
Commissioner McDaniel, did you have a question?
You spoke about this not being about the brand of GoCo, but more of a campaign. Can you give me, and maybe I missed it, a little more insight about it's a multi-year campaign. Do you see it like evolving to another phase from what you have from the timeline that's listed here today?
Yes, so right now we're about to approach our board at the December board meeting, the GoCo Board of Trustees meeting, and ask for the budget that takes us through fiscal year 20. So right now GoCo is in a 5-year strategic plan launched in 2015, the Protect, Connect, Inspire plan. And in the next 18 months, GoCo's Board of Trustees will be thinking about what the strategic plan for the future looks like past 2020. So there's almost a no-brainer in terms of the campaign supporting, at this time, our current mission and strategy as an organization. But of course, year to year, what the campaign looks like evolves significantly. So out of the gate, we had a 0% awareness for the campaign itself. We had to build a brand for Generation Wild from the ground up. So many of the tactics I showed you, including billboards and TV advertising and bus shelter build-outs, were built with the intention of generating awareness fast through high-frequency, high-visibility media. In the second year, we were able, because we saw a 65% brand awareness after the first year, to pivot to not just increasing awareness for people who are new to the state, people who are new to being parents, but we were able to pivot a bit also to more engagement and activation-oriented tactics. We also have been growing the partner program to such an extent that we wonder if into the future this is really more of a collaborative partner-funded effort across multiple entities. So every year and on an ongoing basis, we're revisiting the strategy for it and determining how it supports GoCo and its partners' organizational missions, and then we'll determine when it's time to retire that campaign or to say that we've addressed the issue in a sufficient manner for the organization and its partners. Does that help?
Does.
Okay.
I really, it was one of the things I was thinking about when you were speaking was, well, could the rest of your partners, including us, do the same thing with you on Generation Wild and kind of adopt the same, I'm not sure what you call it, but big goal and so forth and carry it forward, because if, as effective as you've shown the results to be, there's, you know, no need to reinvent the wheel, so to speak.
That's exactly right.
And we're all kind of going towards the same goal, which is getting people outside or outdoors in Colorado and protecting our natural resources. So it kind of makes sense.
It does, and that's exactly how we see it. We did a significant amount of partner and stakeholder outreach before the campaign even launched and have been growing that partner network over the last year. But this year we hope to retrench with partners and figure out how we can get even better alignment to make it a coordinated movement.
Thanks.
Commissioner Pepler.
I have a couple curiosity questions for you. You mentioned that your 100 Things to Do list was distributed. Who and how did you do that?
Yeah, so that's been a really exciting part of the campaign. The 100 Things to Do Before Your 12 list has activities that range from things that are easy to do in the backyard all the way to the backcountry. And we even built the list with the same partner network pre-launch so that we could ensure that partners' recommended activities were voiced in the ultimate creation of the list itself. And then in the first year, we printed 150,000 copies in addition to making it available on the website and using a wide variety of tactics and messaging to point people to it. We shipped 150,000 lists to state parks, to every library in the state, to park and rec centers and through local government partners of GoCos, through nonprofit partners, and as we could, through schools. So we had it actually wasn't that hard to get 150,000 lists out the door. And we felt a little bit successful recently at a CPW Soul Family Nature Night when a couple of kids came up to our table and said, "Oh, that list, I've already done it." We did reissue the list though in the second year of the campaign. We've already gotten about 110,000 lists in the second year out the door through the same partner network, but also added partners.
Commissioner Garcia.
So you said that you're not trying to build the GoCo brand, but then you keep talking about your brand. What is the brand?
So the brand of the campaign is Generation Wild.
Okay.
It's a movement to inspire kids and families. We did have some co-branding on many of the tactics, like a small GoCo logo, to say this information is coming from a credible source, from a source that's not trying to sell you anything other than health and happiness and future environmental stewards.
What was the hook to get the moms involved?
So, we did extensive research at the outset of the campaign to understand moms' attitudes about the outdoors, how often their kids got outdoors, why they didn't get outdoors more often, how they felt about their lives, and acting as chief experience officers oftentimes within their families. And they told us, we see it. We don't need to be reminded that there's another issue in terms of child development happening here. We understand that there are benefits to getting outdoors. We just need tips, inspiration, and reminders to do it more often. And what's been really valuable about that particular target audience, at least at the outset of the campaign, is that moms told us they would share the campaign, and they have. So they've actually become an effective marketing channel themselves.
Right.
Commissioner Taylor.
This is fabulous. Has GoCo identified what the success metric is for? It says you're going into the plan building for phase 3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we definitely see 10 tapping into this culture shift a bit more as a priority of ours to sort of uncover this idea of an overprotective culture and this need to let our kids free in the outdoors, which is something we explored in the second year, and we hope to hit on a little bit more in year 3. But in early strategy conversations, we also see the need to just double down on what we're saying. Habitualize the behavior of getting outdoors. Even if it's 5 to 10 minutes, remind moms and dads and grandparents, because our target audience is expanding, more often to do it even in a small way and year round. So exact key performance indicators or success metrics, in terms of how we'll measure our messages against that concept remain to be set and will be set within sort of each of our channels and tactics. But big picture, that's where we see ourselves headed. What'll be interesting to see is that we don't have a longitudinal measurement and evaluation strategy set now because we just completed our longitudinal study. So as part of our ongoing strategy talks, we'll be thinking about what's next in terms of continuing to track attitudinal and behavioral change. So we'll be meeting back up with our partners from social change measurement world and trying to establish what that trajectory looks like. And that's really dependent on what the runway for the campaign looks like and the board's appetite to continue it into the future.
Let me ask a kind of a loaded question. Rosemary, how much have we got invested?
To date?
To date. Or you can do it by year, however you would like.
So in the first fiscal year, it was just 100,000 as we did research. And then in the 2 fiscal years following that, it was 3.7. And now in the current year, we have a $2.5 million approved budget. So we're still well within our $10.9 million window that the board had loosely established at the outset.
The reason I bring that up is that obviously, if you compare that to Tony's budget, right? I mean, this is a dramatic thing. And the other thing I will tell you, just as a board member at GOCO, is that we have a lot of conversations about this. And I'm not even on the communications committee because, we're taking public dollars. These are lottery dollars, but they're still public dollars. And, there could be a reaction that, wait, you should be buying more land, conserving more land, putting more into open space or wildlife or whatever. And so it's a very, I think that's a very spirited conversation. Even with these great success metrics, even with every member of the board, I think, thinking you've done a great job and the campaign is so powerful and the data is so powerful, it's public dollars being spent in a way that could be controversial. So that's the other side. And of course, GOCO is much more flexible than CPW, much able to spend money much faster. And so if we were to then try to take on a campaign or to join this campaign, we'd have to address some of those issues, the budget issues, the perception with the legislature and with the governor about whether we're spending money appropriately. And so I wanted to highlight all this because every time I see this, I get excited. And yet it came with a lot of work, a lot of money, and a lot of thought. So
that's true, and constant evaluation of it, and knowing that to some level, very long-term outcomes of it are hard to know. And there has to be this comfort, philosophically, with doing as much as you can now to measure and track the change that your campaign is having, but know that, will we know that we've changed a generation of kids? Not for a while, and that would be hard to measure.
And it also, I think, requires a multi-year commitment of the money, and that is another thing that is very difficult, particularly as boards and commissions change over. So it is quite a commitment. It's one I very much support, and I would love to see us more involved. I think it goes to what we talked about earlier, which is getting our story out.
Yeah.
And how could we do that? So really appreciate it. Any other questions for Rosemary? I think Tony's going to close this, right? Oh, there's Emily.
That was a great segue, and I couldn't let that go. We are at the very front of our 2020 strategic planning process, and GOCO staff and board wants to wrestle with some of these big priorities that we talk about at commission meetings, at board meetings, with this group, with CPW leadership and field staff to help inform our 2020 strategic plan. So if it's marketing, if it's whatever priority within future generations. So we're excited for that, and that conversation will be coming soon in the next 18 months. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Tony Gerzik, Creative Services and Marketing Section Manager. I'm really honored and excited to talk to you a little bit about what CPW marketing is, and I'm especially proud of the work that the Creative Services and Marketing team has done. They truly are some of the most dedicated individuals and hardworking individuals I've had the pleasure to work with. And as I talk to people in other states, I'm amazed at the feedback I get from them, that the quality and quantity of work that the Creative Services and Marketing team puts out is second to none truly in this country, and they're some of the most talented individuals in their field. And I say that because even though we do have a small budget, I think we put out some really great work when it comes to communicating Colorado Parks and Wildlife's mission to Coloradans and really to people around the country. As Rebecca said, all of us that work somehow in communication, we have the same three kind of big overarching goals. And that is we promote conservation, and we want to get that conservation story out there and talk about stewardship and the importance of conserving and protecting and managing these amazing resources that make Colorado so special. We also try to build public trust in Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Again, we're government, and there's always this inherent distrust of what we do, and through providing people with good information, factual information, timely information, we try to build that public trust. And ultimately, the goal is to just build a broad public support for not just the agency, but really the mission of the agency and what we're about. From a marketing standpoint, we have kind of two avenues we do that through, one of which is traditional marketing, and the other is social media and digital marketing. Traditional marketing is pretty much what you're probably thinking. It's television, it's radio, it's advertisement in magazines, although I don't really have the money to do much in the way of television. But we have some goals with our traditional marketing, and of course the first one is talking and promoting conservation, and through that branding Colorado Parks and Wildlife. But the other aspect of our traditional marketing is again more traditional, and that is it becomes sales oriented. We help educate people around specific dates and around specific opportunities. So for example, as we get closer to the application deadline for big game species, we'll probably do an email push on that. It'll be in our newsletters. We put out posters on that for our license agents to put up to remind our customers when that deadline is. As we get closer to the summer, which is right about now, the summer 6-month window for making camping reservations, we'll again remind our customers that now's the time to start making those plans and thinking about it. So again, trying to get those people to, if they're not already customers with us, to become customers, and to get existing customers to continue to work with us and visit us either at our state parks or by buying hunting and fishing licenses. We use a variety of outlets, primarily magazines, Encompass magazine through AAA, 5280 magazine are just a couple that we use. The official Colorado Vacation Guide put out by the Colorado Tourism Office is another great opportunity for us. And one of the things we've learned with a lot of these media sources is they love what Colorado Parks and Wildlife is about. They love the message that we're saying, and as a result, they usually give us screaming deals. Otherwise, we couldn't really afford to take out an ad in 5280 magazine. And they oftentimes give us really great placement. Sometimes the inside front cover, or sometimes just 1 or 2 pages in from that. One of the first places where most people will turn to. We also do a couple things broadcast-wise. We've sponsored the last couple years the Fishful Thinker, which is a television cable show on fishing. Chad LaChance, some of you probably know him, and he hosts that show. And he's really highlighted the last couple years fishing in Colorado, and specifically fishing at our state parks and our state wildlife areas. And then we also do some radio with the Total Traffic Network and sponsoring some of those traffic reports. Social media and digital, our goals are a little bit different with this. It's not so much sales driven, but really becomes more aspirational and helping people to visualize what Colorado has to offer, and getting people really interested in getting outdoors and recreating, or getting outdoors and participating in a stewardship effort. I get asked quite a bit about how Facebook and all that does, so just a few numbers for you. Right now on Facebook we have around 220,000 followers, and we reach an average of 500,000 people a week. Excuse me, 500,000 people a month. Last year, when I talked to you a little bit about marketing, that number was 1 million people a month. One of the things we've seen, and you've probably heard about this on the news or read about it, Facebook has really tweaked the algorithms they use. So those mathematical formulas to determine who sees posts in your news feed. And because we're a large organization with a large number of followers, Facebook pretty much says we're not going to let too many people see what Parks and Wildlife has to say unless Parks and Wildlife pays for it. And so far, we don't spend a lot of money on paying for that. Most of our growth in Facebook, or pretty much all our growth in Facebook, and the people we reach is still organic. So although the numbers are quite a bit down from what they've been in the past, they're still much higher than most organizations our size actually see. And again, it's because the content we put out there, people like and they engage with and they share, which does tick us up on Facebook's scale. Instagram's probably become one of our best channels right now for reaching people. Facebook tends to track a little bit older as far as the people who are using it and following us on it. Instagram tends to be a younger demographic. There also isn't those same restrictions that Facebook has on there, so people are more likely to see our posts on Instagram. And we're growing that quite a bit right now. I think we're around 80,000 followers, and that continues to grow quite a bit each month. One of the other things that we're doing from the digital media standpoint is we developed last year the Colorado Phishing App. It's a great tool. It actually takes the fishing atlas that you might be familiar with from our website, and it's repackaged it and put it into a great mobile system with a really good, simple, easy to figure out user interface. I think we're around 30,000 or 40,000 downloads on that. We're promoting the code treks, which the director spoke about earlier today. And soon I'm hoping to come out, we're working with a partner to put out a very, very simple app that will help anglers identify the flies that are hatching and match those flies to actual artificial flies to use. So a real simple app that I think will be just another great tool in our arsenal. Again, like everyone talks about, partners are so important, and certainly from a marketing standpoint, we couldn't do nearly the amount of marketing that we're able to without great partners. We already heard quite a bit about GoCo and Lottery, but two other partners that oftentimes we don't hear too much about is Colorado Library, both the institution, and for those of you who don't know, Colorado Library is a division of the Colorado Department of Education, and through them we've worked with every public library in Colorado, including a tribal library, some military libraries, and some higher education libraries. And we make available to each of those libraries 2 park passes that can be checked out for 5 days at a time. And that's just been a great success, not only in getting people to visit our state parks, but in that partnership we formed with the library. We've been able now to use the library to promote other things that Colorado Parks and Wildlife is working on. About 33 million people visit a library in Colorado every year. In addition, we're able to promote some of the things that the libraries around the state have to offer and form some great partnerships with that. The Anythink libraries in the Front Range in the Denver metro area, because of this partnership, this year for their summer reading program, instead of giving away a Frisbee or something like that, they decided to give away a $3.50 gift certificate to Colorado Parks and Wildlife, encouraging people to use that gift certificate, that was half the price of an entrance fee, to use that gift certificate to go and visit a state park. Again, it was a great way to really kind of show people the importance of being outdoors and away from screen time. And then the Colorado Tourism Office. We do so much with them. They promote Colorado Parks and Wildlife, hunting, fishing, wildlife viewing, our state parks, hiking, biking, all sorts of outdoor recreation opportunities. We're often one of their very first go-to organizations they reach out to when they have media inquiries. The earned media we get through the tourism office is huge, and they've been just a fantastic partner to work with, and we don't hear about them too much when we do these sort of presentations.
Tony, explain the backpack in your picture, because I think that's a neat feature.
Yeah, so with that hang tag, so with that park pass, when you go to check out that park pass, you check out a whole backpack. And that backpack will have not only the park pass in it, but also some field guides. It'll have some brochures of Colorado State Parks, as well as a pair of binoculars for people to use. And we've surveyed the customers who have used this and learned that all of those things that are in that backpack are really pretty important to them. And the feedback that we've gotten, some of the letters that have been written back to the libraries about this has really been inspirational. People going out and visiting a state park, sometimes for the first time in their entire lives, and they've maybe lived in Colorado 40, 50 years, and they've never been to a state park before. So it's been just a really great way to expose people to some new outdoor opportunities. So the future of CPW marketing. We want to continue to talk about and really increase how we are talking about conservation and the importance of conservation. With that, outdoor recreation. And one of the things we're going to start doing more and more of is using outdoor recreation as kind of that platform to then talk about conservation. One of the things you've probably noticed when you read the draft SCORP report was that over 90% of Coloradans recreate outdoors at least a couple times a year. That means all of us have outdoors and outdoor recreation as a baseline. So using that as a foundation, we can start having discussions on conservation. And we can start having discussions about people's impacts on habitat and on trails and the areas they're recreating, and start finding ways to mitigate those impacts, and really bringing those shift principles that Commissioner Zimmerman talked about earlier, and bring those shift principles into everyday conversations. And I think we can do that through a lot of, through marketing and through using recreation as that foundation to talk about conservation. Just a couple small little programs we're working on that I'm really excited about for next year. One of them is upland game bird hunting. I don't know about you, but I hear from a lot of people that Colorado is just not a small game state, right? Everyone talks about deer and elk. We spent all morning talking about hunting licenses and big game licenses here in Colorado. But really, small game hunting in Colorado is pretty great, and it doesn't get the attention that it deserves, especially upland game bird hunting. So right now, this fall and winter, we're working with a volunteer and some of my staff to follow him around. And the goal is for him to hunt every species of upland game bird in Colorado this season. Next summer, we'll start to highlight that with videos and blog pieces and try to get people really excited. Colorado probably has as many, if not more, upland game bird species than any other state. There's 10 of them in Colorado. I'm not sure we're going to get ptarmigan this year. It ends Sunday. I keep getting told that they're still going to try to get it. I'm not sure how they're going to go ptarmigan hunting right now with the amount of snow that's on the ground, but we'll see. But with those 10 species, I think we have a really neat opportunity to kind of highlight what Colorado has to offer. And for all the species of birds that he's going to hunt, it'll be on land that's publicly accessible. So either public lands, CPW lands, or walk-in access.
Commissioner Bray, did you have a question? Or
Madeline had a comment.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Bray. I was going to just save this for a side note, but back to the backpack and the library pass for state parks. This commission has talked about that program in the past, but maybe not for a couple of years. And I just wanted to point out how much great visibility I think the agency gets through that program. At my local library, I just asked them the other day, and they said they have a wait list 30 deep for those passes. They're so popular. And then just this fall, my family and I were up camping at State Forest State Park, and at the visitor center there was a backpack that you could check out, and it was full of all kinds of goodies, and it was so great for the kids. They really loved it. So just with a little bit of investment, I think you make that experience so much better and so much more enjoyable for people.
Absolutely, and that second backpack you talked about is a great program that a lot of our state parks just take on their own. and purchase these backpacks and fill them with things that people can use on the trail and make them available for anybody who visits that particular state park. The last thing I wanted to mention, just kind of a small marketing thing that, again, we're really excited about, and that's the Colorado State Park and Hatchery Passport. So I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with the National Park Service's Passport, and anytime you visit a national park, you can kind of stamp it. State parks had something similar a while ago. It was sort of outdated and needed to be updated and refreshed, and so that's what we did. I think all of you have seen it. If you don't have a copy, I've got copies with me I can give you. Every time you visit a state park or a hatchery, there's a stamp there that you can stamp this. We launched it in, I believe it was September. My staff's going to kill me for not remembering the exact date. I thought we had until this spring before somebody were to fill this up. If you fill this up, you'll get a couple prizes. And the Friends of Colorado State Parks is a partner with us on this. And we already had somebody fill up the entire thing. So they visited all 41 state parks and all 15 hatcheries that offer a visitor center or tours of some type. So we're a little behind in getting them the kind of some prizes, and but they're really excited to do that, and they're going to let us talk about them a little bit more in the future. So if you don't have a passport, make sure you see me and I'll get you one of these. And then as you go around the state for various meetings, make sure you stop off at your state park and your hatchery and get this stamped.
Tony, can I give you an idea I encountered?
Yes.
So I was in Nebraska, and I've never heard about this, but then I got a prairie chicken a couple weeks ago. And so people started telling me, oh my goodness, you have got to go for the Nebraska Upland Slam, which I'd never heard of before. And so now I have to go find a sharptail somewhere in northern Nebraska. And I would never have gone on that hunt if I hadn't had somebody tell me that the state of Nebraska is going to give me a certificate and a pin, which I bet costs about $1, right? And so I was really struck by that program. You know, we could do the same thing. It would be different species in Nebraska, but I mean, and the other thing too is it's really centered on public land, so everybody could participate. So I thought that was a clever idea, and I don't know if we could do something where it's bobwhite, scale quail, pheasant, sharptail, or something like that, but it seemed like a pretty cheap way to generate more enthusiasm. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'd be a great way to do it. And you know, with 10 of them here in Colorado, going everywhere from, you know, prairie chickens out and pheasant out here on the plains to ptarmigan up at the top of our peaks, there's some really neat opportunities to do some of those things. So yeah, absolutely. I think we'll definitely do that. Because
if it strikes me, that's a big millennial type thing, is to achieve that type of adventure. So.
$1 pin.
Well, I think that's what it's. I can't imagine it's much more.
Yeah, it might be a little bit more, but I know several people noticed the pin that I was wearing here of a sage grouse. We can do something along those lines for people, and then yeah, it'd probably be kind of cool.
Well, great. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Any questions for Tony or for any Commissioner
just
Garcia?
Real quick, maybe I missed it, but social media, Twitter. I know that one of the great things about having become a commission member is I started following, and it's maybe the only tweet I get every day that puts a smile on my face. It's pretty nice. Thanks.
And I didn't mention Twitter, but yes, absolutely. Twitter's another great social media tool that we use. And as Rebecca said, each of our regional PIOs also has a Twitter account, so we can get some information out to people right away on that. We're also looking at other possibilities on some things like Pinterest. Haven't decided yet how we want to utilize that, and of course we've got to carve out some time to make that happen.
Great, thanks very much, Tony. I think we'll be back to you.
Very good, thank you.
Next up, Mr. Eckhart with chronic wasting disease. Welcome, Matt. Very subtle.
Good afternoon, Chairman Howard, excuse me, Commissioners, Director Brochide. This agenda item addresses the chronic wasting disease response plan, proposed as a two-step commission process. This is an information item today, and we are presenting you with our draft plan. We anticipate this topic will be an action item at the January meeting, which would be step 2. Before we get to the response plan, I'd like to provide a refresher on chronic waste and disease, knowing that we have 4 new commissioners and they did not see our presentation earlier in the year. This map shows the distribution of chronic waste and disease in North America. There's 3 shades of gray. The lightest shade of gray is North America. The darkest shade of gray on the map is in the region of Colorado and Wyoming. And that shows the distribution of chronic waste and disease in free-ranging populations prior to the year 2000. The lighter shade of gray around that, and in Saskatchewan and Alberta and the Midwest towards the east, that's where we have free-ranging herds that are infected with disease in 2018. CWD is a nervous system disease found in members of the deer family. For Colorado, that means deer, elk, and moose. It has a 100% fatality rate. CWD is found in over half of Colorado deer herds and over 1/3 of Colorado elk herds. The disease is higher in deer than in elk, as far as prevalence goes, and higher in elk than in moose. For deer generally die 2 to 3 years after infection. Adult buck deer generally have 2 times the prevalence rate of adult does. This prevalence difference between sexes is not seen in elk and moose, where the prevalence rate is about the same between the sexes. Disease transmission increases with prevalence. The higher the prevalence is, the greater numbers of animals that will become infected each year. And when CWD prevalence is high, it may have a drastic influence on a herd. It increases mortality, essentially shortens the lifespan of animals, especially of adults, and can change the age structure of the herd over time. In regards to human health, although there has never been a human case of a prion-related illness resulting from CWD, we still recommend avoiding contact with and consumption of CWD-infected animals. Colorado has lived with and monitored CWD for several decades, and this map shows the distribution of the disease of prevalence in Colorado for adult mule deer by herd from 2014 to 2017. And the darkest brown on the map, that color shows where prevalence is greater than 10%. The lighter brown on the map shows where prevalence is 1 to 5%, and that yellow color that is covering much of the state, that's where CWD has been detected, but prevalence is not known due to small sample sizes. This is a map of Colorado's deer herds. I hope it's in color on your screen. If it is in color, each color represents a different deer herd, and each herd has a different number. Each herd is managed according to its own management plan, which is now called a herd management plan. And what is not well known is that CPW has already been factoring CWD into management decisions in several herds for quite some time. Note the herd units circled in red on the map. CWD is either written into the herd management plan in these units or has been part of the consideration in license setting for multiple years. Statewide, CPW has partly or entirely been relying on hunters to voluntarily submit and pay a subsidized rate for CWD testing. These voluntary testing submissions have been low in the recent years, but they have contributed to our knowledge of CWD prevalence trends. Because these voluntary submissions have been so low, and CPW's concerns have been high in some herds, in 2017, we resumed mandatory testing in priority deer herds to achieve reliable prevalence estimates at the herd level. Hunters are required to submit a sample for their harvested deer if they chose a hunt code that was selected for mandatory testing. In 2017, we selected the following 6 herds for mandatory testing. And I don't know if my laser pointer works, but in D7 in the northwest, it's the herd number. It's the White River herd, D42, Rifle Creek herd. In the southwest is D19 and D40. In the northeast was D4 and D10. We were targeting large sample sizes throughout mandatory testing to achieve those reliable prevalence estimates. And we did achieve large sample size. We did achieve strong prevalence estimates in 2017. And even though this is only 1 year of data, those estimates do provide a sufficient basis for making management decisions. Mandatory testing results showed that prevalence was high in some deer herds. For D7 in the northwest, prevalence was over 15% in adult males and over 25% in certain GMUs, game management units, when we broke down the data to that level. Preliminary data for D2 that we're testing in 2018 indicate that prevalence is 18%. D2 and D7 are Colorado's largest mule deer herds, so these results have solidified our concerns over CWD and the need for management now. We should recognize that Colorado is not facing an emergency management situation that calls for drastic actions. We're identifying high prevalence areas through mandatory testing, and we will consider management actions to reduce CWD prevalence and keep it low. Hunter participation in CWD testing has provided us with more accurate understandings of CWD in our herds and is the basis of developing statewide guidance on management, specifically the draft management plan, the response plan that we're talking about today. In March, the Commission established an advisory group to inform the development of a CWD response plan. In the first meeting of the advisory group, a charter was established to clarify the roles of members. The duty of members was to represent their stakeholder groups and to facilitate communication to and from their constituents. 5 meetings were held, April, May, July again, and September. All were open to the public. All meeting notes and presentations are available on CPW's webpage that is devoted to the advisory group. We created a webpage just for that group. This advisory group was valuable to CPW because it allowed members to discuss management ideas and incorporate stakeholder perspectives into the draft response plan. The plan has 3 major sections. The first major section is a 15-year monitoring plan. The second section is a prevalence threshold for compulsory management. And the third section is management actions and recommendations. So let's start with monitoring. The CWD response plan will launch a 15-year monitoring plan that relies on 5-year mandatory testing rotation schedule. A rotational approach will test and retest herds to show how prevalence responds to management actions over time. Testing every 5 years allows adequate time to show a meaningful change in CWD prevalence while ensuring that upwards of 40 different herds can be included in mandatory testing. We do not expect prevalence to increase on a year-to-year basis by a significant amount. That's why 5 years also makes sense. This 15-year rotational approach will be reevaluated and is subject to change as we learn more about prevalence trends. We do intend to include elk in mandatory testing over the next few years. This has been a common question. But once we finish testing most of the priority deer herds. The table on the right on this slide comes directly from the response plan and demonstrates how this rotation looks on paper. So you can see in 2017, we tested 6 herds. We're going to retest those herds in 2022, at least the ones that we're going to be prescribing management for, and again in 2027. And overall, the cost that we're focusing on to conduct monitoring and mandatory testing each year is in the range of $175,000 to $200,000 a year. That's what we're currently doing. And that allows us to test a certain number of samples each year. So we can stop there, Chairman, and take any questions, or we can move on.
Commissioners, questions, comments? Commissioner Bray.
Question I have is, can we get that PowerPoint on our pads? Because we don't have it, or I don't have it.
I don't get it.
I have the narrative, but I don't have his slides,
Okay,
What are the mechanics to do that?
at least at some point.
It should have been in the, it's not in the.
It's not in the PowerPoints.
No.
Okay. I can get it in there.
I think it might be easier to email it. I'm having issues, and I know some of the other commissioners have issues with their, I can't get it to re-download, so I think it'd be great if you could email it, Laura. Thanks. Commissioner Vigil.
I have a question. What did you say the number of deer you're going to sample? 200-some thousand?
the total number of deer we sample, as far as mandatory testing goes, in the ballpark of around 3,000. Total for the state, including all species, and including voluntary samples, is between 4,000 and 5,000.
Okay. That's a pretty small sample size, but that's just in the game management units where you found CWD. That's not statewide, right?
That's statewide right now. Yeah, our mandatory testing is testing last year around 3,000 and more than that this year. D2 is a big herd.
Commissioner McDaniel.
Recently, I've sent Bob a couple of emails that have come to me from different states about voluntary CWD testing, some different methods to try to encourage hunters to bring their heads in for testing. And I'm just wondering, I mean, I appreciate that we're going to do mandatory testing on a rotating basis, but to continue to gather data from around the state, I would just encourage you to think about, other voluntary ways to get folks to bring, their heads in for a test of some kind. At the risk of getting laughed out of the room, perhaps we can give them a preference point for bringing the head in.
Do they have to pay for it?
But then they have to pay $50.
We have the option of waiving fees. We did so this year in D7 as a follow-up to last year's mandatory testing. So fees were waived for bucks. And we're considering this in the future for units in the plains units as well.
Yeah, I would encourage that we don't ever charge a fee for an animal to bring in to be tested. I'm just going to discourage people from bringing them in. That just doesn't compute for me to require payment for it. Not if we want the data.
Commissioner Bray.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, I think some of us at the last presentation expressed that we would be willing to provide funds for testing. We've got a little surplus going on the wildlife side. I'm sure we could dedicate some funds. $200,000 to $300,000 a year is not very much money for the data and then as far as getting volunteers, the Colorado Outfitters Association has volunteered to go to class to learn how to take samples. Could help. There perhaps places of where they take their animals in for processing and stuff. Perhaps some samples could be gained from those people. They couldn't do the test, but they could at least be taught how to take the sample. It's just some ideas that are out there.
When we get into the cost issue, when we try to increase the number of samples, we also run into capacity issues on staffing. So it's not just the cost of sampling. So that figure I gave you is what we're doing now at our current levels of staffing, temp staffing, and the cost of sampling to doing the test. Ready to move on?
Yeah, let's proceed.
Moving on to the prevalence threshold. Deciding when to take management actions to reduce CWD prevalence in our herd is a serious consideration and a controversial one. We decided that a single threshold was the best way to ensure management actions would be taken, and it was less confusing than having multiple thresholds. If a reliable prevalence estimate for our herd is below a set threshold, then it suggests that management actions are taken at some level to keep prevalence below that threshold. But if prevalence is above the threshold, management actions will be taken to reduce prevalence until it is below that threshold. How prevalence is reduced, and specifically what management actions would be taken, will be at the discretion of CPW managers overseeing each herd. Our best chance for success with fighting this disease is to maintaining healthy herds, is to keep prevalence low. That's the name of the game here. Currently, we are most concerned about reducing prevalence in some deer herds, and we have established a prevalence threshold specific to deer. Prevalence in elk and moose is less of a concern at this time, but if it does increase, we will consider creation of a prevalence threshold specific for elk or moose. A 5% prevalence threshold was set for adult male deer. This is the lowest threshold that we believe is realistic to manage to in herds statewide. The lower the threshold, the fewer the animals that will be infected and die from CWD. The lower the threshold, the greater ability we have to keep prevalence at low levels. A threshold that is higher than 5% would mean we have to be willing to accept higher annual infection rates, higher CWD-related mortality, and there's a greater chance that we can lose the ability to manage, to control this disease. A more thorough explanation is provided in the plan in regards to how we reached 5% and why the threshold is specific to males only. I was trying to keep this at a higher level. The detail was there in the plan, and we took a lot of time to try to explain it clearly so the public can grasp it. So I highly suggest reading that section of the plan prior to January when we go to more of an action item. We can stop there. Is there any questions on the prevalence threshold?
Any comments or questions, Commissioners? Let's keep going, Matt.
Management actions and recommendations is next. The response plan includes a suite of management actions and recommendations that local wildlife managers can implement at that herd level. The suite of actions is seen as tools in the toolbox that maximize the flexibility of herd managers when determining how to reduce prevalence or maintain prevalence at low levels. At the same time, and this is important, managers will still be working to achieve the population and herd composition objectives set in herd management plans. The actions presented in this plan are seen as adjustments and not changes from the existing management framework of herd management plans. So let's say that mandatory testing reveals that a herd's prevalence exceeds 5%. The herd managers would determine which actions or multiple actions to take that is best suited for that herd to bring prevalence down below 5%. The first two actions they may consider might be to reduce population or density or to reduce male to female ratio. If either of these management actions is selected, herd managers will strive to reduce population or the sex ratio to the lower end of the objective range identified in the herd management plan. Remember that the population and sex ratio objective ranges set in herd management plans have already been approved through a public process and are approved by the Commission. Once this aspect of the response plan is well understood by the public, I think many of the concerns and imaginations of what CPW might do to the deer herd will be alleviated. Hunter harvest will be the primary tool used to reach the bottom of the objective ranges, and there are various ways that CPW can adjust license to reduce population or change the sex ratio. The next action is to change the age structure. Without changing the population or sex ratio, managers could change a herd's age structure towards a younger population. This is likely an unpopular direction to take, but we include it as an option, as a tool in the toolbox. The next option is to maximize the ability to remove diseased animals at the smallest scales possible. Because CWD positive animals are not uniformly distributed across a herd, it makes most sense to focus disease management where prevalence is the highest, within what we call hotspots. Management prescriptions made by herd managers will be at the smallest scale possible, provided sufficient data are available. The next two are recommendations. First one is to remove motivations that cause animals to congregate. The identification and removal of point sources that cause deer, elk, and moose to congregate is the basis for this action. CPW already has a regulation that restricts feeding or attracting wildlife, and the Commission has set a policy that further limits the conditions set on emergency winter feeding. What remains is for CPW to cooperate with producers, landowners, and agricultural authorities to minimize unintentional attractants. As for minimizing prey-on-point sources, this action includes a series of recommendations that intend to educate different segments of the public in regards to movement and proper disposal of CWD-infected carcasses. Moving on to the last recommendation, the incorporation of these actions and the prevalence threshold of this response plan into herd management plans. This is more of an internal recommendation that we will follow when revising management plans for relevant herds. Again, there is far more detail provided in the plan. We can stop here to take any questions on management actions.
Any questions or comments, Commissioners? Commissioner McDaniel.
So what will be step 2 of 2? This is step 1 of 2. I mean, what will be expected of us in January based upon this set of data and presentation you're giving to us today? I mean, is it going to be this report and this presentation, and we're going to make a really big decision about how we manage all our herds in the state? Because if that's the case, I feel like I don't have near enough data. So I'm kind of wondering what's the mechanics? How's it going to work?
So you have the draft response plan, and that's what we will be deciding on. And everything that we would provide to you is included in that plan, what we're proposing. If there is any specific request for information beyond that from the Commission, we can provide that. We also are hoping to have a panel discussion that includes members of the advisory group that met for those 5 meetings over the course of 5 months. And we can have a panel discussion on the thoughts and ideas and some of their perspectives on this plan.
That's in January, Matt?
That would be proposed for January's meeting.
Commissioner McDaniel.
A couple of requests. Maybe I get confused about a couple of things, but one of the things I'd like to kind of see is this connection of this data seems, I won't say segregated or narrow in that it doesn't connect to, you know, the situation, the habitat situation in each area, how that might be affecting the deer herd and so forth. And then sometimes and maybe it's just me, I get conflicting information about, or at least I'm understanding it differently. Herd health in a region where it can't really be, and I'll just take specific DUs we've seen recently along the Front Range, which have higher prevalences of CWD that we can't really manage in hunter harvest. And we talked about we can't issue more licenses to manage them. I see this recommendation, yet those herds are over objectives. They're not crashing. So the data conflicts for me. I got a higher prevalence, I got a growing herd. But we need to go in and lower the buck numbers. I'm trying to connect all those dots, and then is it more of a habitat situation? That's why that herd is growing even with the higher prevalence? Do you get what I'm kind of stumbling here with my question?
Right, and you're stuck on, for that example they provided, reducing buck ratios. That is just one option that we can take. And you're right, there are certain herds that have an increasing population, and they are maintaining a higher prevalence rate. So their population isn't declining at this point. It will in the future if we let this disease go, most likely. Now, if there's still things that we can take. There are other tools in the toolbox that we can take that we are not already taking to try to bring prevalence down in those herds. And that's listed out in the plan.
Still not sure I'll get there by January, but.
Commissioner McDaniel, so you're asking for more than what's in the study?
Yes.
Yes. And how would you describe the more?
I'll call it a connection of other data with regards to habitat, the herd management plan, the encroachment of people and others in the areas that we're talking about these populations are at. Some connective data, I'll call it, and maybe there is none. One thing I noticed in the response plan is many of the studies cited are very old. They're not very recent data. 2005, 2001, 1990s. Well, that's not really recent data on CW, and maybe that's the best that there is at this time. But those would be the kind of questions that I would ask about that. I'm struggling with the ask for, but I'm trying to get a better grip about why this is, to me, a fairly drastic response. It will be drastic to our customers when they see this. So how can we as a commission feel really justified that this is the most appropriate response for the agency to take? And of course, we'll have to stand and defend it over time.
Okay, yeah, we'll have to capture exactly what you're looking for and try to meet those needs.
Why don't I make this suggestion? Commissioner McDaniel, why don't you get with staff and work exactly, and then keep us up to date so that we know what's coming as well.
I should have never opened my mouth about it.
No, it's great. And I'm sorry that Commissioner Haskett had to leave, because she's obviously been kind of in the forefront of this. But it just would be great, as we saw today, that when we get there in January, we have what you want so that we can make a decision, right? And I think actually the information will be hugely helpful to all of us. So.
And it was so controversial, and I know you and I discussed it briefly. If you go to states like Wisconsin and others that have taken pretty drastic action on herds, they got such, response from the customers and from the sportsmen. And I feel we will get a similar response based on perhaps plans that we take, and just need to feel this commission, at least for me, I need to feel really confident that directionally is where we have to go to manage the health of the herds here in Colorado.
We'll have some information to share. We've done a public survey, a hunter survey, to try to get at that, and I'll get to that in a few more points that I'm about to make. But in January, we're also hoping to provide a review of that survey that we conducted. It involved 3,000 hunters. It was, I think, 2,000 residents and 1,000 non-residents. But overall, what I think Reed's coming up here to help me with is that this plan is more of an overarching statewide plan. It's a guidance document. It's not down to the data level. That's intentional. We're going to be making these decisions as we go along. As we learn more, it's going to change the plan. But this plan right now reflects our best understanding, our best information that we have today.
Anything to add, Mr. DeWall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Reed DeWald, Assistant Director of Wildlife and Natural Resources. This was an issue that the working group really struggled with as well. It was felt that we were making one statewide plan to manage all deer in the state, and I think that may be something you're wrestling with right now. The way that we are approaching this as the advisory group is that this is just building the toolbox, and we're asking you guys to approve the tools in those toolboxes. Those questions about habitat, herd health, and all those will be made at more of a local level. And then you would see those again when you approve the herd management plan, similar to what you're going to do tomorrow. And so those drilled down discussions are to come. We'll be asking for, are these appropriate tools? Do you approve of these tools? So that we can have those discussions with the herd management plans at the local level. And that will be a whole nother discussion that's yet to come. I don't know if that gives you any peace of mind as to what we're going for.
Reed, when I read through, or Matt, when I read through very carefully on the CWD plan, what I saw was if we do take adaptive action, whatever that is, we're staying within the herd management plan as it exists. And if we wanted to, the most controversial, if we wanted to take more bucks under this, you'd have to come back to us to have that new herd management plan with the higher buck numbers approved by the commission. Is that right?
Yes, you're exactly right. Those discussions would come before you again. So we would have that local discussion with the public, more of a public participation there, and then you would see those or approve those actions in the herd management planning.
Because I think it's important for our public stance to be that we are not going outside of the herd management plans that we already have approved without coming back to us, because that's a strong pain point with the customer, that be a public decision with input from them. So, yeah. Great.
All right, let's move on to the public comment discussion. We opened a 30-day web-based public comment period for the month of October to gain public feedback on the Cwd Response Plan. We received only 32 comments in total. Roughly 1/3 of them were critical, 1/3 were supportive, and 1/3 were not relevant to the plan or only filled out the brief survey that we provided. 3/4 of the respondents were hunters. As for the comments that were critical of the plan, some members of the public were concerned that, one, there's not enough science or monitoring to support taking drastic management actions. 2, the 5% management threshold is too low. 3, focusing management only on adult buck deer is unacceptable. And 4, there was disappointment that mountain lions, a predator of CWD infected animals, were not part of the CWD response plan. All of these concerns, some being misunderstandings, were considered in discussion of the CWD advisory group and among staff during the drafting process. And we do not plan to make further changes per these comments. I did want to read one critical comment because I think it gets to the heart of the concerns of hunters and outfitters, and it's here in orange on the slide. Hunters do not come from all over the world to hunt 2- to 3-year-old bucks in Colorado. They come to hunt and harvest mature deer. The actions and recommendations being made to limit the number of mature deer is unacceptable. And I wanted to address this comment because I've heard this a lot over the last year. My response is that if CWD is not managed and prevalence increases over time, the disease will kill a higher proportion of animals, of mature bucks, in each year. This is exactly the direction we don't want to go, which is why we are proposing to manage the disease now. If hunters share this concern, we ask that they think long-term and consider what will happen to mature bucks if as much as 50% or more are infected with CWD. In that scenario, we would be losing 1/4 of a buck's, mature bucks, to disease every year. In addition, this comment exposes a common misconception that the CWD management actions will remove all mature deer within infected herds. And as Chairman Howard just said, this is not true. The immediate management actions that change buck-to-doe ratio or the population are within the confines of the herd management plans. They are within the sideboards of those already set management objectives. On the other hand, the supportive side of the comments, some respondents agreed with mandatory testing. Some showed strong support of using the lowest threshold possible. The plan is based on, as I said before, the best information we have available today. And we know enough about CWD, in our opinion, right now to start disease management. Also, keep in mind that the plan is adaptive and will be changed over time as we learn more, as we execute the monitoring plan, and as we learn more about how prevalence responds to management, and whether or not that management threshold of 5% for adult bucks is realistic. So that's all I have for you today, and if there are any further questions, I'm happy to take them.
We have public comment to come. Why don't we take that public comment, and then if there are further questions for Matt, we'll call him back to the podium. First up, a good friend, Marty Holmes from the Mule Deer Foundation. Welcome, Marty. Good to see you.
Thank you, Commissioner Howard, Director Broscheid, and commissioners. My name is Marty Holmes. I'm the Colorado Staff Regional Director for the Mule Deer Foundation. I live in Wetmore and been around this arena for a while, as you all know. Hi, Jim. Good always to see you. I'll tell you what, I hope I look as good as you do when I'm your age. Actually, I'm old.
My 40s,
I just want to give a shout out to Matt. Matt asked me to be a part of this advisory group in April. He said, Marty, I think we need you on this. I was a little hesitant at first, to be honest, because I kind of had a gut feeling potentially where this could go, based on what CWD was doing in other states and that you were all reading about, as I was. But I thought, you know what, some of the champions that step up to the plate and get on the field. So, I'm glad that Matt asked me to be on it. A lot of interesting discussions over the months, but I really want to, if you would, just join me in a round of applause for Matt. He's a heck of a scientist. I'm not a fun thing sometimes. You think this preference point stuff was tough. You're dealing with some things there that you can compromise. You're talking about people. We're talking about an organism or a folded DNA I mean, try to wrap your mind around that. And here I am, 8, 9 months into this, and we were talking in the hall out here, a few of us a while ago, and I'm still not sure I can really get my mind around it. We're dealing with something here that 25 other states is dealing with, looking at us as the leader. And we are, as Director Broscheid and others know that have been to the North American and the WAFWA meetings, we are the leaders. I've heard Dr. Mary Wood in Wyoming, the veterinarian there, twice now in her presentation, and they're really wrestling with it. They didn't think they had it at all, very little anyway, and now they realize that they have a very serious problem, way more serious than what we have, and they haven't even begun to really get off the ground like we have in Colorado. So, I think the science will give us, my little quote here is, I think the science will give us the direction. Do we know it all now, what we need to know? No, we don't. I mean, it's hard to even understand. I don't think we totally still understand how this thing is transmitted. We do know that the concentration aspect of it is serious. I made a prediction to some other people. You can put it down in writing, but I think this urban deer issue is going to continue to spread the disease, because everywhere we've had concentrations of CWD, especially with deer, it's spread. The prevalence rate has gone up, the infection rate's gone up, and the death rate's gone up. So I think we're going to continue to learn a lot more as we move along on this. I know it gives heartburn to some people. It gave heartburn to me, knowing that I'm going to get the same kind of questions as you are, Commissioner, from folks as we move along with this. But no action is not an alternative, and Wyoming has done that. And they're again, just give a call to Dr. Mary Wood, and she'll tell you about what happens when you have no action. So we're blessed. We have somebody like Matt and the staff and all to be working on this. We're gonna limp along with it. We're gonna do the best we can, and hopefully some things will fall our way. But I think we've got a good plan. I'm for it as it stands right now. I encourage you all to really read this stuff and talk to Matt if you have questions before that meeting in January, so you're up on the learning curve. I'm sure I know more than 99% of the people out there, and when you look at sportsmen and other folks that even hunt, as complex as it is to them, I can't imagine how this boggles the mind of the general public. So try to get them to wrap their mind around it is going to be very difficult. When you talk about some of these other issues, it pales in comparison to what this is. So, again, with that, I just encourage you to get up on the learning curve. I know all of these things are complex. We have a complex business, is what I tell people all the time, and what we do as people in the wildlife arena. It's not easy. Some people look for the silver bullet. Some people look for the quick fix, and it's just not there. And we constantly kind of have to square off against people that think that, well, it's just, our era of instant gratification doesn't mesh very well with what we deal with. So, again, I can just encourage you to really delve into this, because this is something that's going to have some long-term impact. When you look at the number that was mentioned earlier, 212,000 applications in the state for deer, units D2, D7, our largest herds, this could have some potentially serious implications. And again, just look at Wyoming. If you dig into what they've been faced with 50% prevalence rate in some of their herds, that's not a good thing. Everything goes bad from there. Revenue, you can imagine the fallout from that. So we need to understand it. We need to work together, and we need to further along this whole effort. So enough of the bad stuff. I just want to say it's been great to be a part of that and some other committees this year. 2018, a great year. Director Broscheid, you've had another outstanding year leading this crew. I've enjoyed working with everybody. Yeah, some other good things. I mean, JT, he survived a year now, isn't it? Yeah, JT. That's a good thing. We've got him trained now, I think, in the Northwest, and he's done a great job. And it's been great working with him on things that I've had interaction with. And Doug Vilsack, Future Generations bill passed. Everybody really pulled together. We had a rough 2017 on that. 2018 was better. We got it through, and I think a lot of us are really glad that we had that accomplishment. So for those of you that are new on the commission, good luck with it. It's probably like drinking through a fire hose right now, but stay the course. You got some good people around you, and do your homework, and you'll be able to make a great contribution to wildlife in Colorado. So thanks a lot for the opportunity to comment, and any questions, or I'll have a seat.
Commissioners, any questions for Marty? Thanks very much. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you tomorrow, too. Commissioner pardon me, there's a slip. Dan Gates.
Chairman, thank you very much. In the essence of trying to save the chair and the commission some time, I'll defer any further comment at this time until January, based upon today's presentation, and give you guys a chance to decipher some of the information that we worked on in the working group. But I'll have comment in January. Thank you,
Dan. Commissioners, I asked Margaret Taylor if she could start us off tomorrow on the future state parks selection criteria, and she's agreed to do that. So we're going to have as our last item now the study on future funding mechanisms for CPW. This is the Meridian Study. So, Robin, if you could come forward, welcome.
Chair?
Commissioner Vigil.
Can I make one question going back?
Of course. Who would you like to ask?
Comment and then let commissioners ask.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry.
Matt, you mentioned that the limit on testing more deer was staff, number of staff. Is that right? Is that technical staff? Or can you use temps to do it? Or are there entities out there that we could hire to help us do some testing?
We'd have to discuss what range of increase in testing we're talking about, and then we can come back to you with a better assessment of what the staffing needs would be. Because permanent staff are involved, CSRs are involved at the front desk, bios are involved, temporary staff that are coming on just for testing CWD are involved. So there's a lot here to consider, depending on the level of testing that we would be considering.
Well, and I'm thinking to follow up with Commissioner Bray's comment. We have some wildlife cache that we can free up if that's the limit. So don't say there's a limit just based on your budget, because we do have some funds to make available.
And right now, the plan that we put before you is based on a budget that we have. So if we wanted to increase, say we wanted to increase testing of elk beyond what we were proposing to do in the next few years, we'd have to consider additional resources.
Just ask. We might give it to you. Thank you.
Commissioner Taylor.
If I may, I appreciated the reference of the quotes, the testimonials from some of your feedback. The quote, and I wrote it down. It impressed me that CWD is a serious threat to our deer, elk, moose herds, and I want CPW to do whatever is necessary to keep healthy populations on the landscape, regardless of what that means for my hunting opportunity. That spoken like a true steward. I appreciate that comment. So, thank you for including that.
Thank you, Matt. Robin, I think we're ready. Sorry, Jim.
Okay, thank you guys, and thanks for holding on until the end. I realize that we're quickly approaching the 5 o'clock hour, and it's been a long day, so I'll try and keep this as energized as possible. I'm hoping to maybe talk for 30 minutes and then save some time at the end for questions and some back and forth. So I was asked by CPW to conduct this study to explore potential funding ideas. I worked with a small team from my organization, Meridian Institute, and then we partnered with an organization called Earth Economics that did the revenue generation estimates that are included in the study. And the study explores a range of funding mechanisms and ideas, including some that engage user groups other than sportsmen, anglers, and visitors to state parks. So let's see. Is it advancing? Is there a trick that I'm not aware of?
You have
Oh, there we go.
I just did it.
Oh, okay. So the study had 3 components. We started with a literature review where we took a big broad look at what other states are doing to fund their state park or their wildlife agencies. And then the next step was we started to do a Colorado-specific analysis where we looked at some of the components that make Colorado unique or that make oh, great. Wonderful. That make the state unique, including some revenue generation estimates for the state, which I will just make a quick note that there are quite a few ideas in the study that have not not been tried in other states, so this is relatively new territory. And as a result, some of the revenue generations are sort of quick calculations. They're based on the best available information and good economic methods, but this is uncharted territory. The next thing that I'll say is we also looked at some of the political feasibility of these funding ideas in the state of Colorado, and particularly the implications of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which has some pretty significant implications for any of the tax-based funding mechanisms that were included. And then the third part of the study was a really large and robust stakeholder engagement process, which I can talk about in a little bit more detail. Is this? Oh, got it. Okay, so we pulled together a group of advisors, and this was about 15 people that could guide and inform the study. We met about 3 times throughout the process by telephone or video conference, but I also had a lot of one-on-one calls with this group to really think through some of the key questions and test some of the ideas and make sure that we're connecting with the right group of stakeholders as part of the consultation and the study. So the group included thought leaders on this topic, including sportsmen, wildlife and conservation advocates, the outdoor industry, outdoor recreation interests, and CPW and DNR staff. So let's see. Okay. We then reached out to a whole bunch of different stakeholder groups, and this took sort of 3 major formats. Oops. Very excited now. So the first is we met with quite a few groups that were already meeting. We got on the agenda on some of the existing existing meetings. So, for example, the Colorado Snowmobile Association, the OHV Coalition, the Sportsman Roundtable, the Colorado Outdoor Partnership, and the Colorado Outdoor Alliance and the Outdoor Recreation Advisory Group. We were able to get time on the agenda, talk with those groups, and also stay after, and a lot of times talk over breaks or lunch or dinner or wherever it took us to get additional feedback on some of the ideas. And then there was a handful of groups that we felt like it was really important to engage with directly, especially because many of them are implicated in some of the funding ideas. So we convened in a couple cases some of the key groups for a couple hours, including the Front Range and the Western Slope mountain bike community, some of the non-motorized boat and water sport community. The group that I'm going to try really hard to not refer to as the non-consumptive users, but this includes the conservation community, some of the wildlife enthusiasts, and outdoor recreation user groups. And then we also met with a subgroup of the CPW leadership team. This meeting was a little bit different. It was more to talk through what some of the challenges might be for implementing some of these ideas and the sort of the behind the scenes questions that might arise, not necessarily, well, not at all their preferences for these. Then we conducted a whole bunch of interviews with a wide range of people that either weren't able to make one of these meetings, but we felt like their voice was really important to hear. We also talked with a lot of people in other states that might be familiar with some of these funding ideas or mechanisms, and they could tell us a little bit about how they worked out in their states and what some of the challenges and opportunities are and that type of thing. I think it's the end of the day. The computer's done with it. So this is also a quick little map. We held meetings all over the state. So it was sort of the funding idea roadshow for a couple of months. And the sum total of this was we talked with more than 200 people and started to hear a lot of the same ideas over and over again, which is, for me, one of the metrics of we've done our due diligence and really hit a lot of the major players on here. I don't want to promise that we talk to everybody. There's certainly a range of perspectives, and I think we got a good sampling of it. But there are many groups. There are many different perspectives within the user groups that we talk to, and we sort of scratched the surface of that. So before I dive into the 9 specific funding ideas that we looked at in a lot of detail, I want to provide a little bit of the flavor of some of the overarching feedback. There were some key themes, questions, comments that seemed to come up again and again in the discussions, and these aren't specific or tied to any one of the funding ideas. They sort of cut across many of the funding ideas. And so the first one, I made the note on here, relevance. There was a wide range of perspectives on this, but for a lot of the outdoor recreation community, there were a lot of questions about who CPW is, what they do, those types of questions, and sort of how far, both jurisdictionally and statutorily, your work extends. And I'll put a finer point on this. I think there was 3 sort of groupings of ideas that I heard. From some, we heard that CPW is something of an unknown entity. So we heard from, I'm thinking about in particular a conversation with some of the Western Slope mountain bikers, and many of them said, I don't know that I've ever interacted with CPW. So I think that that's worth noting. The second is, I think that there were some questions about particularly some of the user pays funding ideas that target the outdoor recreation community for an agency who's primarily focused on wildlife or on state parks, and particularly for an outdoor recreation user that may primarily visit county lands or federal lands, and their primary purpose for recreating might not center around wildlife. I think there were questions around that. And then the third one is, I definitely heard from some stakeholders who had a specific negative experience with CPW and had some reluctance to consider funding ideas that would contribute to the agency's mission that might not align with our values. And I'll use the example of some of the recent decisions on predator management that came up in a couple different meetings with a couple different stakeholders. The next cross-cutting point that I'll point to is transparency. I heard a lot of positive comments from various outdoor recreation users, particularly many that are currently contributing, like the OHV, the snowmobile, and the sportsman communities, about the current level of transparency about where the funding goes and how it's used. And that was sort of seen as a best practice that should be considered when moving forward with any new funding ideas. One of the most common questions I received was, what does CPW need funding for? And I think that in order to move forward with any of these ideas, it would be really important for CPW to make a really compelling case that identifies specific funding priorities before pursuing any specific funding mechanism. And then, particularly for many of the funding ideas that explore user pays models, the stronger the relationship with some user benefits, I think that the more palatable or more enthusiasm there was for those. And it's not a direct relationship, but I did hear a lot. It was easier, and there was, and I'll use a really quick example, the mountain bike registration fee, which we'll talk about in a second. There was enthusiasm for it, in part because it may support trails, which was a demonstrated need within that community. So I'll get back to that in a few minutes, but wanted to point that out. And then the last point on here, I heard loud and clear that there's a real desire to make sure that none of the funding ideas cause unequitable access, and particularly from groups that have been traditionally underserved or have not utilized state parks or appreciated Colorado's wildlife, that we want to make sure that those are resources that are available to a wide range of people. So with that, we looked at 9 ideas in more detail. There we go. And I have grouped them into 3 categories. So there's taxes, fees, user fees, or use fees, and then the third category is voluntary contributions. And I'll talk about them in those sort of clusters because there's some similarities within those clusters that I think are illustrative. And so the first category is taxes. And before I dive into the details about taxes, I think it's probably worth saying a few words about TABOR, so the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, because it has significant implications for any of the tax-based funding ideas. How it plays out is slightly different for each of them. But essentially, the challenge with TABOR, any new tax is going to be extremely difficult to pass in Colorado. For any of the funding ideas to be dedicated revenue for CPW, it would require a constitutional amendment, which is even more difficult to pass. And then the third point that I'll make is that CPW also currently has an enterprise exemption status. It's one of very few state agencies to have this status, and that's because less than 10% of their funding comes from tax-based sources. So in order to not lose that enterprise exemption status, no more than 10 to 13 million could be generated annually from any new tax-based revenue sources. So that's how that plays out. So the three ideas that we looked at in detail in this study, the first is a general sales tax. This is the model that's in place in Arkansas, Missouri, and Minnesota, and it's a 1/8 of 1% sales tax on everything, so it across the board at the state level, and that is dedicated towards their Parks or Wildlife Agency, depending on the state. I'm going to skip to the very bottom one on this list. So the excise tax on outdoor gear. This is something that's never been done at the state level. It could potentially be modeled off of the successful programs of Pittman Robertson and Dingle Johnson. So the idea is that it could be a dedicated tax on specific outdoor gear or equipment. There's a couple things that I think are worth noting at this point. The first is that this is one of the few funding mechanisms that I heard very strong opposition from a single group. In this case, the Outdoor Industry Association strongly opposes any sort of new excise tax on gear. And I'll also mention that at the state level, this gets very complicated because you're potentially distorting the market or changing consumer behavior, encouraging people to drive across state borders to purchase the tent or the boots or whatever they might have considered purchasing at their local store. The middle idea that I want to talk about is the dedicated revenue from existing sales tax on gear. And this is an idea where you are essentially earmarking funding that is coming from a single source within, and so this is not a new tax, it is a behind-the-scenes Department of Revenue calculation that calculates the revenue generated from outdoor gear, and then that amount is earmarked in the state budget for Colorado Parks and Wildlife or a state agency. This recently was on the ballot in Georgia last week, and it was passed with 83% support, so really strong support for this. It is, again, Tabor makes this particularly complicated in Colorado, and I can talk through some of the complications there. I will really quickly say all of these have pretty good revenue generation. I should also say something about the table. I realize this may be too difficult to read. It's included in the study. It's in the conclusion section, so you can look at it in more detail there. I wanted to, in one place, capture the funding ideas, the potential revenue generation, the Tabor implications, any notes on the political viability, and some of the key points from stakeholder support or opposition to these. And the color coding is the relative support for this funding mechanism. So you can see the green revenue generation indicates it generates quite a lot of revenue compared to the other funding ideas that are on here. The orange color indicates that there's some sort of major or significant barrier, in this case Tabor, and the associated political challenges with that. And I will also say that the color coding it's mine. It's somewhat subjective, but I did have some criteria that I was using when assigning those colors, so I'm happy to talk through that if that would be helpful. I have to be very patient. Oh, it isn't? Oh, hey, Laura. Okay. So the next ideas that I want to talk through are some of the user or use fees, and we came up with and sort of tested 4 ideas here. So the first one is a vehicle registration fee, and there's a couple different models that this takes in different states. So some states, this is essentially a parks pass that you can purchase at the time that you're registering your vehicle. It's essentially like a one-stop shop where you get a parks pass, you still pay for it, this normal parks pass, or perhaps a discounted rate, but it's sort of an incentivized or an easier to purchase annual parks pass. The second model is what happens in Montana or Connecticut, which is either a mandatory or an opt-out fee. So you pay $5 or $6 when you go to the DMV, and then when visiting state parks, then your license plate, your in-state license plate essentially is your parks pass, and so visiting those state parks is then free for in-state residents. They still charge out-of-state residents. This has only been used on the park side, so CPW is unique that it has a parks and a wildlife budget. And this historically has been used to support state parks. The revenue generation calculations on this vary widely. It sort of depends on if you're offsetting the current park generated revenue and then setting a fee that supports that, or whether or not you're looking to make additional funding on top of it. It's likely to not have Tabor implications, although there's some question about if a non-enterprise exempt agency is collecting the revenue instead of an enterprise exempt agency. And depending on if it's mandatory, opt-out, opt-in, there's some questions that arise. One of the more interesting things that I think came out of this one is there's lots of questions about equity. You're simultaneously asking people to support, especially under a mandatory model, asking people to support state parks that may not visit the state parks. But there's also questions about decreasing the barriers to entry for people who the entrance fee may be cost prohibitive, so you're making it easier for some populations to visit the state parks. So some interesting questions there. The next two are on here are related. There's a mountain bike registration fee and a non-motorized boat registration fee. Both of these are modeled off of the current systems, or off of existing current systems. So the mountain bike registration fee, we built a lot of the assumptions for the economic analysis and for some of the others off of the current OHV and snowmobile registration programs. We did, for the mountain bike registration fee, we looked at a per bike, per rider, or a hybrid model. So the per bike would be more like the OHV program, per rider would be more like a fishing license, and the hybrid was a base rate for one rider and with one bike, and then an extra $5 per additional bike for the really avid riders that have lots of mountain bikes. And for both of these, there's no Tabor implications because they're a fee instead of a tax. The biggest difference here was in the stakeholder support, and I heard from the mountain bike community a fairly strong, fairly high degree of support for this idea. I think they have seen the success of the OHV and the snowmobile program. Certainly the people I talked to, which is sort of at the organizational leadership level or the county level organizations, they see the real need for trail maintenance and some dedicated revenue for that. I also tested the idea with the mountain bike community of could 10 or 20%, some portion of this go towards non-trail related funding priorities, and I would say there was generally a positive response to that. I think there was a recognition that could be really mutually beneficial, that could be good for the broader CPW objectives, and also a good way to address both the impacts of mountain biking and also the benefits that they get from the wildlife that they get to see when they're out mountain biking. I would put the discussion with the mountain bike community in contrast to the non-motorized boat who were not open or enthusiastic about some sort of funding idea moving forward at this time. And I think that's largely because there's not the same connection to a user benefit, or at least not as direct of a connection to a user benefit. So at this point in almost every presentation I gave, then somebody would raise their hand and say, instead of slicing and dicing all the different outdoor recreation user groups, can we come up with some funding idea that is just across the board and addresses everybody? And it could be hikers and bikers and bird watchers and hunters and fishers, and the full list. And instead of sort of dividing this up, could we have one all-inclusive outdoor idea? And that's kind of where the Colorado Outdoor Stamp concept came from. I also heard this on some of the panels at the Crested Butte Commission meeting. I think this was an idea that got floated around there. This has never been done before. There's a lot of logistic questions about who pays when and when it's mandatory and what enforcement looks like and things like that. But just the level of enthusiasm and the degree to which many of the groups came to this idea on their own, I think it's really interesting, and I think it is a concept that may merit some additional exploration. Our revenue generation fee, we assumed a $10 fee, and we looked at some of the SCORP numbers, so that's where that comes from. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so then the last category was voluntary contributions. And so here we were looking at ways that non-mandatory ideas, the two that we explored in detail. So this first one is incentivized voluntary contributions towards a habitat stamp or a habitat stamp-like mechanism. And we wanted to look and see if there were ways to encourage people to voluntarily purchase a habitat stamp or create something that looks a lot like a habitat stamp, but the funding could go somewhere else, or it could be structured slightly differently. And the experience in other states, the experience in Colorado with this type of incentivized voluntary contribution is very challenging. We looked at two specific ideas. One was encouraging river outfitters to encourage their clients to purchase a habitat stamp, recognizing that many of them will be enjoying Colorado wildlife as part of their experience here. The other idea that we tested was to look at membership-based organizations, and particularly Colorado membership-based organizations. So think your local mountain bike club or some of the recreation groups that are active in the state, and to see if they could incentivize as part of their annual membership other people to purchase some sort of habitat stamp or habitat stamp-like mechanism. The revenue generation estimates are pretty low. We didn't believe that, based on what information we had, that this would be a large, robust funding mechanism. It could be challenging to implement, and we sort of received a lukewarm and somewhat skeptical response from many of the groups that we discussed this with. And then the last one that is on the list is technology-based donations. So we explored a couple of different ideas for how technology could be used to incentivize voluntary contributions. There could be some sort of text message campaign where at a trailhead, you can scan a QR code and give a $10 donation to a state park or something like that. We also looked at app-based ideas. So some of the existing CPW apps, I think that they have a donate button already built into them, that type of thing. Or are there other app or technology-based tools? I think that there's also a lot of interesting ideas that came up about how this technology piece could relate to some of the other ideas. So could the mountain bike registration fee be electronic through an app instead of a physical sticker or something like that? So I think there's some ideas there. This is also a low risk or a no risk option. There's maybe some opportunity costs of people giving a $10 donation instead of some sort of bigger purchase in some other place. But I really think that these could be some good ideas for building a larger support and sort of engaging different groups and addressing some of those relevancy questions, that type of thing. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so I also wanted to really quick capture some of the other funding ideas that came up in some of the discussions. And this is not comprehensive, but these are the ones that I heard more than once or that started to repeat. So we didn't explore these in detail, but I didn't also want them to get lost in the shuffle. So the first one was some sort of ski pass or a ski equipment registration fee. I also heard that with future sports gaming taxes coming down the pike, that could be a potential statewide revenue source. We could consider a statewide plastic bag fee. There's been some local efforts at this, and I think that it's often framed as a fee, not a tax. Real estate transfer taxes, a couple other states have used. It's an interesting concept because it ties some of the habitat fragmentation that's associated with development pressure to the funding source. But in Colorado, it's impossible. Under Tabor, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights has a specific clause that prohibits new real estate transfer taxes. I've heard lodging or transient accommodation tax. This is a significant revenue source for a lot of local governments and municipalities and things like that. So it would be challenging to consider something like this in Colorado, and runs into all of the Tabor tax problems. I also heard enthusiasm for trailhead fee or recreation area fees, and for snow park or other parking-based options that some other states use. So I just have one more slide. Laura, do you mind advancing? Thanks. So I just wanted to, I realize it's 5:15 after a very full day. So the 4 points that if you leave here sort of thinking about this study, these are some of the observations that, at least to me, sort of jumped out. The first is any taxes are going to be very challenging because of Tabor. The second is there was pretty good support for a mountain bike fee, with funding going primarily to user benefits, but also potentially to some broader wildlife or other benefits. There is enthusiasm and excitement about this idea of some sort of Colorado outdoor stamp, but it really needs kicked down the road a little bit more, and some additional thought on exactly what that could look like and how it could be set up and that type of thing. And then the last one is that the CPW, both through potential funding mechanisms and in the lead up to future funding mechanisms, should continue to think about opportunities for partnerships and increasing relevance and that type of thing. And I think that this is both these funding mechanisms could be a good path towards that. I also think that there's some groundwork that could be done in some cases that could potentially benefit or build support for future funding ideas to be considered. So I will stop there and see what questions you guys have. And I realize I did cover a lot of the details pretty quickly, so I am really happy to answer any questions.
Commissioners, questions, comments? Commissioner Garcia.
I'm just curious. I didn't see the gaming tax or gaming fee.
Yeah, so go ahead.
I was curious because Anschutz is just starting to put a ton of money into esports. And nationwide, there's big dollars going into that. And I don't know enough about it to be even close to be able to talk about it. But if there's that much money ahead in that, is that what you were talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other comments or questions?
Go ahead.
Madeline, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to give a little bit of context, and maybe you did that, and I was in the back getting more tea, so I apologize. Just for a refresher for existing commissioners and a little bit of a reminder for new commissioners, last year when CPW and DNR were talking with the legislature about the Future Generations Act, the idea for this study came up many times in conversation. The discussion went about sportsmen really provide the majority of funding for your agency? Why don't others pay in? And instead of coming up with a legislative fix in that moment, we offered to do this study to really answer those questions. So there's really real legislative interest around this that precipitated the study initially, and then I think the conversations that this commission has been having over the last year I think underscore the fact that a lot of people are thinking about this and talking about it. So I just didn't want to lose that context for all of you.
Commissioner Garcia.
I was just curious, when I looked at this originally and the sales tax idea, I thought, the voters just aren't going to go there. And then I sat and watched what Denver did in our election this year, and the majority, the numbers that voted to pass the sales tax for parks in Denver, I was shocked. And so I thought, well, maybe that's a lot more of an opportunity than I thought was really possible. So then I had to ask myself, and I need you people to tell me, this enterprise fund, what is the risk of losing that exemption?
Director, you want to take that or pass that off to one of your staff?
Justin told Robin for the report you could get Justin up here.
Yeah, is Justin out there?
Yeah.
Justin, if you could,
Justin.
Our CFO, we got a question for you. And I think he has no idea what the topic is.
The question was losing our enterprise status, accepting sales tax, what that would do, other than losing enterprise status.
Yeah, so I think my concerns there are, sorry, for the record, Justin Rudder, Assistant Director of Financial Services. If we don't go through a constitutional route where we kind of debruce the revenues, it just becomes And so there's a sales tax that's depositing money in the general fund. We would then get a general fund allocation. If we lose enterprise status, I think the real issue is that when you're swimming in the general fund pool, as soon as the next downturn hits, if there's not a constitutional protection to keep those monies coming to you, then they're going to disappear. We've seen Department of Natural Resources as a whole has seen every agency except for Division of Water Resources lose their general fund over the last 20 years. The budget just gets squeezed, and we're not education, we're not HICPUF, we're lower down the priority list.
Commissioner Zimmerman.
Is there a way to cap how much sales tax we can get without risking that enterprise status trigger?
Sure. So we can accept up to, at this point, up to 10% of our revenues can come from state and local sources. At this point, we've been in the 7 to 10 million these past couple of years. Part of that is the ANS and species conservation general fund transfers that we've received from the legislature. But severance tax also counts as state money. So we could, if we got a appropriation of $19,999,000, we would retain our enterprise status. And now that I'm thinking on my feet a little bit, the second part of the losing enterprise status is so I'm not aware of an enterprise losing status and going back into the Tabor pool, but I would assume that our revenues would all count against the Tabor cap. I'd assume that we'd have to take our 1994 revenues when we first entered enterprise status and grow those over time and see where we're at current revenues based on what we would have been allowed to grow at under Tabor. And so I think it could be initial budget cuts. And then when we have really good years, we are creating more potential Tabor revenues. We're creating more money against the cap. And so that's where we start getting squeezed. We may not be allowed to ask for more budget increases because we are taking money for every extra dollar we earn. We are taking another dollar away from K-12 or from another general fund source. So,
Commissioner Garcia, I live in Boulder, so every tax increase goes through with one exception that I can think of. And I think the problem would be it'd be a statewide vote. And so, you know, the enthusiasm in Boulder and in Denver for tax increases is not shared widely throughout the state. So I think that would be the barrier. Just a thought. I could be wrong. Oh, Commissioner Taylor.
Was there and I'm thinking back to the June or July commission meeting in Crested Butte, was there a statement that I saw or read or heard about a recognized shortfall of 30 or 35 million in a period of time to come? Am I making that up?
Was that if we didn't get the Future Generations bill? I think.
Is that, and do you remember what I'm referring back to the sentiment of what does CPW need the money for? We know that there's a declining participation on the sportsman's side, right? And we know that there's generally a need to get, particularly with the younger generations, to engage people in the outdoors. And so we know those things, but what exactly is the financial shortfall that we're trying to also achieve by this?
So I think, yeah, if I may. So I think the $30 million number you may have heard was part of our justification for the Future Generations Act and why we were doing the fee increases today. The things that were in there are basically taking care of our own. There's recruitment and retention, but there's $40 million worth of dams. There's maintenance and maintenance backlogs, capital construction backlogs. There's the need for habitat work and other activities that can increase our herd sizes. So we have a list of 10 things in the bill that we kind of listed out that added up to that 38 million. And that's in those last two slides of my presentation. Those assumptions are buried into there that build up to the large shortfall.
Thank you. There's in several of the meetings, whether prompted or not unprompted, there was quite a bit of sentiment for, particularly among the mountain bike crowd, but I think generally among the outdoorist sector, the term that the Outdoor Industry Association has used for the general outdoor recreationist, to provide value and be valued in the conversation. And I think that there was a comment from the Western Slope Mountain Biker Forum that said, let's do more with more money. And I thought that was a great statement too. You know, more trails, more trail maintenance, more access. Of course, this was mountain bike centric, but expanded availability of funding for planning and building and maintenance. competitive bike grants, et cetera. It went on, but and addressing regional needs. I think that it was wonderful to hear a general vibe and consensus for let's do something, and we're willing to pay. At the Trail Summit that I attended, there was a quote. I have several notes here, but there was a quote that said, one of the opening statements, we have to pay something, folks. I think everybody, generally the room was nodding, so.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
Oh, Commissioner Zimmerman.
Oh, this is just a general comment. Thanks, Justin. I would certainly agree. I've definitely heard the same thing, that we've got to pay something. And when I'm asked the question, what's the funding for, I often come back to without engaging the changing and growing demographic of the state, CPW risks becoming irrelevant to some of those folks that aren't our general everyday constituency. And I strongly believe, and I think probably everyone in this room believes, that when CPW is successful at our mission, we benefit everyone in the state. Whether that's someone who gets to a state park once a year, or whether that's someone that goes outside every single day and utilizes and benefits from nature. So when I think about why CPW is the right place for any of these solutions and other solutions, I think about the fact that we are the only agency that can manage across multiple jurisdictions, and that do manage across the various jurisdictions. And I think about all the cuts that we experienced 5 years ago, all the things that we're not able to do that we really need to be doing to be better at achieving our mission, and to be able to handle the onslaught of what's coming our way that we're already experiencing, as Commissioner Bray mentioned, just in the past decade, what we're experiencing from habitat impacts and habitat loss and impacts to wildlife from growing demands on recreation. If we don't learn as an agency how to manage for that, get ahead of that, offer opportunities that people want, and that's coming back to Commissioner Taylor, what you were saying about that, opening up the lines of communication, that bi-directional communication. Robin's heard me say this, Madeline's heard me say this. This, to me, this study is less about the dollar amount and more about the communication. So, we may sit up here and think that mountain bikers wanting new trails means big backcountry 25-mile mountain bike rides into the backwoods. That may not be the case. It may be that mountain bike, depending on where you are, you may have a mountain bike group that actually says, no, we want to build this flow trail right at the edge of town in this old, what used to be an abandoned something or other, an old quarry or something like that. No, we want to have something that we can do like a lunch loop in Grand Junction. We don't want to be out affecting herds that don't ever see any people except for during hunting season. We want to be here in town. That's great, that's music to our ears. But we don't know that if we don't have this bidirectional communication. We're trying to go build trails out where mountain bikers are like, oh man, I got to ride 20 miles to get out there. So, I think, I know I put a lot into that whole statement, but I think that the relevancy, the branding, the marketing, the telling our story, the why we need funding, I think that's just getting our semantics and our story straight, coming up with a few different taglines to make sure that we're saying the right words that resonate with the right groups. I'm not as worried about those kinds of hurdles. I am worried about some of the hurdles of phasing and timing. What do we do first? What do we do second? What do we do third? And I have a pretty good idea from talking with Robin. We start with maybe we look at doing a legislative action on the existing sales tax on outdoor gear and cap it so that we don't risk our enterprise status. Maybe we look at something like that. Certainly we look at a mountain bike registration fee, and then we start working on a Colorado outdoor stamp of sorts, whatever that may look like. And that may be a 3 to 5 year forward thinking, whereas the mountain bike registration fee could be 1 to 2 years. So that's my sort of gangle of thoughts.
Mr. Taylor.
The Colorado outdoor stamp, I think it was, Robin mentioned also in our meeting that it was affectionately termed at times the stoked stamp. So I thought that was pretty great. I also wonder if, in thinking about that, is that, with the $300,000 marketing budget that Tony and his team are working with, and does something like this that has the potential to really be a material engagement piece with the outdoor community, is that something that could be, I know there were a couple references in the report, I think page 15, it said nearly all states are experiencing a shortfall in funding. Page 19, question about user fit and focus. Is CPW the right agency to represent this? And the question potentially maybe it's could there be a national campaign that Colorado be a pilot project for or a pilot program for? And Commissioner Zimmerman and I mentioned this quickly, but is there something? I know there's conversation within the Outdoor Industry Association of whether they become a individual membership organization. At this point, they are not. They're brand and industry level. And is there something that could be piloted and a collaborative approach that addresses this nationwide? That's all.
Commissioners, other comments or questions? Let me then I'll wrap up. I just want to make a comment on it. I read the study. I also got to participate in the Sportsman's Roundtable, so I got a kind of a sneak peek, so to speak. And I think it's very valuable in telling us the past and what exists today. But I would really encourage that we step out of that box, because I look at all of those and I'm not convinced that any of them are viable for various reasons. And I'm happy to be proved wrong, would love to be proved wrong. But an outdoor stamp, well, who's going to enforce that? We already have enough trouble with the DWMs having time to check hunters. OHV, we just went through that. We heard about the difficulty of checking OHV stamps. So I mean, that could be a great thing. I just am very skeptical that it could be enforced in a sense. So just to give you an idea of the things I would love to have us just put in there, and maybe we reject it and do something much simpler. But to me, an app that's on your phone that a mountain biker has that has some sort of, like if you do these trails, you get this kind of award or thing. It's corporately sponsored, so you have, whether it's REI or Trek or somebody else involved on the cost side, and then they, of course, get recognition. And so then when you pass on a particular trail, it's kind of a passive thing that the app handles for you. And so you pay in at that point. I mean, I think we have to think like that. I just continue to, more stamps that our guys have to find, or our guys or ladies have to find, those types of things, until we have more people, I just don't know how, to me they just feel like a voluntary contribution because we can't do the enforcement. So I would just ask, in addition to what we were doing here, let's try and think outside the box. Maybe it's because I live in Boulder, but this is what the Boulder tech community does. Create social apps to capture revenue and make people happy. And so that piece of it, which I know wasn't what the study was about, I think we have to think about that. And just put that on the list. So with that, any other comments? We'll adjourn for the evening. Oh wait, we do have public comment. Let me call, yeah, Suzanne, why don't you come up first? And then we've got Dan Gates, I think. Yes.
Hi,
welcome, Suzanne.
No, thank you. Suzanne O'Neill, Colorado Wildlife Federation Executive Director. Thank you. I wanted to thank Madeline and Doug Vilsack and Bob Broscheid for really making sure that this study took place. I served, as did Dan Gates, as one of the advisors. And I really hope that this commission takes a leadership role in thoroughly examining the report and other ideas too, so that we really come up with some viable funding mechanisms that we all can get behind. I'm sure others will pitch in, others will work on their own. I believe that the Colorado Outdoor Partnership will take a look at some of the options, the ones that were couple that were discussed today. And so we all can pitch in, but personally, I would really, really like to see the leadership from the commission. So I think that's important. And in looking at some of the funding needs, good grief, I think about migration corridors and the challenges that will be faced as Colorado's population goes from a projected 5.3 or 5.6 to 8.3 million by 2050. CPW created a Colorado Action Plan in response to the Department of Interior Secretarial Order 3362 saying, what would be your implementation ideas to improve winter range for big game and also migration corridors? And they came up with priorities, Northwest Colorado, Southwest Colorado, including more habitat treatments, highway crossings, Highway 13, Highway 40, Highway 64, conservation easements. Those are big ticket items and really essential. And so I don't think there's going to be any shortage of funding needs. So thank you for the opportunity to make that comment.
Thank you, Suzanne. Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Chairman, Director, Commissioners again. Dan Gates for the Coloradans for Responsible Wildlife Management. So I guess you could say that you're saving the best for last, or maybe you can throw a bunch of stuff at me and you guys can go to dinner a lot quicker than what you would normally would. First of all, I'd like to say, I think that the study that was conducted was done out of necessity, trying to figure out a way for a future plan of action on how CPW can adjust with the changing demographics of the state of Colorado and where we're at and how that's going to affect how CPW actually manages the resources that it does. I think there's going to be questions throughout the process, either legislatively or through the commission, that need to be addressed. You think preference points are confusing? Try to turn around and open up this can of worms at the legislature. I think that if we don't have the general conversation amongst multiple user groups and you leave somebody out, there's significant damage that can be had out of it. And I look forward to those conversations. As a sportsman, and as a utilitarian, so to speak, I mean, I use all sorts of resources in the state and I engage in all sorts of activities. But as a sportsman, I'm deeply concerned, as are most sportsmen, about the continuing impact that, like Commissioner Zimmerman had mentioned, that the more people that we put in the woods, if there's not some significant benefit back to the resource, back to wildlife, back to habitat, back to water and land conservation, and if that's not talked about at the forefront, then it starts to get brushed aside pretty easily. I don't have a problem with mountain bikers. I don't have a problem with kayakers or dog walkers or what we call stick walkers, where everybody's got two sticks in their hands and they're looking at the ground and they never see anything on their side of them. But I do have a problem with more and more and more of them in the field, and there's not any contribution back into what Colorado Parks and Wildlife has stood for, Division of Wildlife, Game and Fish, previously over the last 125 years. More trailheads is fine, but they need to be maintained and they need to be adequately enforced. I don't know how you get into a voluntary contribution. I made this comment to Marty Holmes earlier that if we did a voluntary deal, everybody would want to go to the Broncos game and not any more than about 76,000 people would go in. But nobody would have to pay. Voluntary, I don't think it's going to work. We tried that with the Habitat and Stamp Committee before, which I sit on. We have budgeting constraints and problems on all aspects of dealing with natural resource management, particularly the wildlife side of it, because we do have a user group that is somewhat limited. Out of 5.6 million people, you got roughly 926,000 sportsmen that you guys at some point in time are going to have to listen to, or at least take the emails from when you end up getting the preference point communication going. I'm all for ongoing communication, as are 99% of the individuals that I deal with, whether they're consumptive or non-consumptive type people or other recreationists. But I do think that some sort of dialogue needs to be created on a more broad scale about what is actually feasible, what is actually imperative that we deal with, as opposed to looking at things from a 30,000 foot level and then kicking the can down the road for the next administration or new commissioners or whoever might end up making decisions down the road. I would ask the chair just for a little bit of leniency per my tirade, since I said the best that would be saved for last, but welcoming the new commissioners. This is a tradition and a heritage that this agency has involved itself in from a management standpoint for the last 125 years. And I would caution you guys in the process that all the decisions that you make, whether of benefit or not so much benefit to some segment of the population, Colorado Parks and Wildlife manages, and I'm saying this more for the record, maybe you already know this, but it manages over 960 species of wildlife and 80 game species. You got 926,000 sportsmen, 41 state parks, 300 state wildlife areas, 5.6 million people, 14.1 million state park visitors, not to mention the regular people that just come in the state to do something that we don't necessarily know about. It's a tremendous obligation and responsibility, and I would ask that you feed off of the constituents and the stakeholders from all levels to provide input, and don't wait for them just to turn around and come to you, because sometimes they don't have the means to do that. Sometimes they might not know about the particular subject matter. And if you reach out to them, more often than not, they are more than willing to provide information or help you accumulate information. I would ask that when you get a chance, there's 2 books. One is, from my perspective, The Sportsman's Voice, and it's a responsive management book. It would be well worth you guys investing in, or at least looking up online and trying to turn around and feed off what the sportsman's heritage and traditions are. I think it would be well worth your time. Another one is Colorado's Wildlife Story. This is the 100-year anniversary deal of it. I would hope that CPW would do a 125-year anniversary, but this will give you a pretty good idea. I'm sure that this is in the CPW library, and there might be some even available for purchase or loan or whatever. But those 2 publications, from a sportsman and wildlife management and habitat management perspective, will give you a pretty good insight of what the tradition and heritage that has been managed over the course of the last 125 years. And I would urge you to do some research on your own, because if nothing else, these are really good reads just from a historical standpoint. And you might even be able to turn around as you sit here for a 4 or 8 year period, be able to look back and see some of the things that you heard about and people that you recognize through the process. So if there's anything that I can do individually, I would ask that you would reach out. If I don't have that information, I'm sure I can come up with it, and I can come up with an individual that would be willing to provide that. But there's a connectivity that we need to engage in, probably more now than ever. And in today's day and age, the collaboration and partnership that we're involved in, it's imperative to have that ongoing communication. And just to tell you where I sit before I tell you where I stand, which I already kind of did that, I sit on the Habitat Stamp Committee. I'm on the Colorado Outdoor Partnership. I'm on the Sportsman's Roundtable. I'm on the Wildlife Council. I'm involved in different multiple organizations. I was on the CWD working group, the trapping work group, now this goose management working group. I don't know, there's probably a bunch of other stuff that I'm not really remembering at any particular time until I get a doodle poll from somebody. But it's imperative for sportsmen to be engaged and involved, to deal with the commission, to deal with higher levels of administration and managers. And I would hope that you guys would continue that conversation for the future, because it's imperative, and I think we're at a crossroads that we need to turn around and make sure. I'm not a kumbaya, hold your hand s'mores type of guy, but I think we need to make sure that we get our acts together when it comes down to what is important for the state and important for the resource. So I'd take any questions, or I'll sit down and shut the hell up.
Dan, you'll be at dinner, I think, right? So
if I'm invited, yes, sir.
Maybe we'll ask you questions.
Okay, good deal. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Why don't we adjourn then? What's the plan, Laura? Oh, Commissioner Zimmerman, okay.
I know, everyone's hungry. I don't know if this is for Robin or for Madeline.